Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. And thanks for being here today. My name is Lynn Mooney, and I'm co owner of Women and Children First bookstore in Chicago. I'm thrilled to be here today, and I want to welcome all of you for what I think is going to be a rich and fascinating conversation. Um, First, though, we begin our online events the same way we used to begin our in store events, and that is with a land acknowledgement. The area we now call Chicago, including the land where this bookstore is located, is the traditional homeland of the people of the Council of Three Fires, which included the Ojibwe and the Potawatomi. This area has long been a vibrant site of life, trade, and community making, and today is home to 65,000 Native people. As the current occupants of this land, many of us are here as the part of the legacy of forced removal of Indigenous people by a settler colonial state. We believe that taking a moment to make this statement is a step toward honoring this truth and toward healing and reconciliation. It can become more meaningful when coupled with authentic relationships and sustained commitment. So I urge anyone interested, whether you are in Chicago or not, support local organizations such as the American Indian Center and also Native art and artists, activists, and organizers in your community. Now I have two quick housekeeping announcements and we'll move on to the main event. I just want to remind attendees, please type your questions into the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of your screen. We love all the enthusiasm and cheering in the chat bar, but it can make it hard then to find your questions. So we do urge you to use the Ask a Question feature for that. And two, if you don't have a copy of The Sex Lives of African Women yet, please use the Buy the Book box, which is also located at the bottom of the screen. Wherever you are, we would like to be your feminist bookstore. So this afternoon it is my great pleasure to introduce two amazing women, Nana Darkoa Sekyiamah and Charlene Carruthers. Nana is the author of The Sex Lives of African Women, with Publishers Weekly described as, quote, an astonishing report on the quest for sexual liberation in their starred review. It was also listed by The Economist as a best book of the year. She is an award-winning blogger and co-founder of Adventures from the Bedrooms of African Women, a website, podcast, and festival that publishes and creates content that tells stories of African women's experiences around sex, sexualities, and pleasure. The impact of her work has been documented by CNN in a film titled Not Yet Satisfied. In 2016, she won a prestigious Hedgebrook Fellowship. Her work has been published in The Guardian, Open Democracy, Essence, and the anthologies Feminist Parenting, Perspectives from Africa and Beyond, and the Routledge Handbook of Queer Africa Studies. Her short stories have been published in It Wasn't Exactly Love and The Pot and Other Stories. Nana lives in Accra, Ghana with her daughter and her dog. Charlene Carruthers is a political strategist, cultural worker, and PhD student in the Department of African American Studies at Northwestern University. She is a practitioner of telling more complete stories around race, a community organizer, and a founding national director of Black Youth Project 100. She is also the author of the book Unapologetic, a Black, Queer, and Feminist Mandate for Radical Movements. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Nana and Charlene. And I'm turning this over to you now.
Awesome. Beautiful. Well, one, when I first got an email from Nana mentioning a possible event, I got really, really excited and thought I was going to see you in person. So I just want to share that with everybody. And then someone from your team was like, whoa, 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 calm down. These are not the exact words. She is not traveling from Accra to Chicago. So I was a little bit in my feelings. And at the same time, just really grateful that you thought of me to be in conversation with. And also just thinking about the few times or the several times we've met each other, including the time when I was in Accra and we met up and you like took me to your sister's store And I think we got a smoothie or something. And you didn't know me. We just have a mutual friend. And so to me, that speaks to your work, of course, speaks to who you are and your values for sure. Um, but just personal interactions with you, to me, really embody what it means to be how you identify as a Pan-African feminist. Like, to me, it's not just about what we write and what we say. It has everything to do with what we do and how we are with other people. And so, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, thank you so much, Charlene. I'm so moved. Like, you've made me quite teary, but thank you so much. It's wonderful to have this full circle moment. And like since we met like so many years ago, I can't remember how many years ago it was now.
Yes.
Thanks to like digital media, we've been able to stay in touch. So, it's been amazing for me to follow your work, your activism. I've also been really inspired by your political clarity, by your commitment to feminist and queer movements, by the book you brought out. And I'm so grateful for the support you've been giving me on this journey as well. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome, of course. So, how about we start with, or we continue with you? You're going to read a little bit for us from this beautiful book. And I'm on a personal pursuit to get all the editions because all of the covers are beautiful. But I'm fortunate to have this one. So, would you mind starting us off or continuing with some reading?
Yes, I would love to start us off. So I think for today, I'm going to do two short readings, two 5-minute readings. Shall I start with like a 5-minute one now and do another one later?
Yeah, that sounds great.
And for anybody who's already got the book and wants to follow along, I'm going to read from the beginning of Chantal's story. So from page 73. In Haiti, voodoo is recognized as a national religion. The divinity of sexuality is close to the divinity of death, which is regarded in high esteem. On the Day of the Dead, usually celebrated in November each year, people do not go to school. If you walk the streets, you see people fall into trances. And at night, you hear voodoo ceremonies taking place all over the country. In voodoo, there are divinities and deities that reflect the spectrum of human experiences. Sexuality has its own gods, goddesses, and in between gender goddesses. Sexuality is vulgar, but not in the Western sense. Vulgar is blunt, courageous, verbal, and sexual. Physicality and the moving of bodies in dance is very sexual. Being able to do these vulgar sexual dances, even in high society, is regarded as culture, and Haitians are proud of their culture. In one way or the other, voodoo permeates all aspects of the culture, even among conservative Christian families and high socioeconomic groups. This was the backdrop to growing up Haitian before the internet. There was closeness to the land. My grandparents would take me to the countryside, and I would see people bathing in rivers, people with their fingers and toes in the earth working the land. This experience of shamelessly seeing Black bodies, of feeling the spirit of labor, of proximity to earth, has shaped how I look at my own Black body. I was about 9 years old when I first touched myself. I thought this was a special thing that only I could do. I had the most powerful orgasms of my life in early childhood, and I could feel how powerful my body was. Mika lived next door to us. He came from a good family. My mother and the community of aunts that raised me trusted him. I felt safe with him too, even though he was only 15 years old, the same age that I was. He was cute, the kind of cute you see on television. He would play his guitar, carry me on his back, take me to the beach. He made me feel good about myself. He could see something in me that I could not yet see in myself. He would touch me, finger me, and eat my pussy with a passion. It took a week of preparation before we both lost our virginity together. He had a perfect tiny penis. Mika and I stayed together for 4 years. At 18, I moved to Montreal to attend university, and broke Mika's heart a year later when I fell in love with someone else who happened to be a woman. I had always loved women. As teenagers, when we played mom and dad, I always assumed the role of a dad and would do anything the girls wanted. The woman I met in Canada was 7 years older than I was. She was prettier than I was. She had her shit together. I did everything she wanted me to. I did her homework, I bought her things. I even shoplifted so I could give her more gifts. One day, we were on the bus heading to the movie theater, which was several stops away from my house. No physical words passed between us, but when we got to my stop, we both got off the bus. I had never walked 3 blocks so fast before. We opened the doors, our lips found each other right by the door, and there we stayed. Time whirled by in a blur of pleasure. I have no concrete memories. It was like a smoke filled dream. Learning each other's bodies, our lips clung to each other, and we twisted and turned our legs so that our clits could rub against each other. I screamed and screamed and screamed as I came. My friends and I typically spent winters sitting in studio-like apartments puffing on weed. We would do some ecstasy, drink some alcohol, and listen to Bob Marley. One of us would start a game, or turn to another and start kissing, or start to peel off the other's layers, and we would end up in a mix of limbs and bodies. At the time, it always seemed like fun, but afterwards, I felt like something had been taken away from me. I felt drained of my essence. I kept waiting for her to want me. She never considered me a girlfriend. I was someone she would see in between fucking guys. It took a year for me to leave, but 10 years to heal. I swore I will never be with a woman again. With men, I knew I was never totally theirs. I was a good fuck, and I could wield that like a weapon. But with girls, I had no defense. And I think I'll stop here.
Woo! So, to continue with my honesty, it was really difficult to decide where to start with my questions here. Thank you for sharing, well, all of these stories, or in particular Chantel's story. And for me, since you began with Chantel's story, I want to talk a little bit about how you think, be it Chantel's story or anyone else's story in this book, speaks to the silences and shame in our societies, and in turn, how these women have either broken silence for themselves with themselves or out in the world. And why does that even matter?
No, I love that, and I love that as a question. Gosh, there's so much. I am like, where do I start? Okay, let's start with Chantal's story. I feel like we have a silence when it comes to the sexuality of women, when it comes to the sexuality also of young children. You know, Chantal spoke about how at 9 years old she gave herself like the most powerful orgasm, so she felt like this was something only she could do. A lot of the women I interviewed had never had any sort of education about sex growing up. If they got anything, it was don't do it. And nobody really said whether it was. So we never really speak openly and honestly to children, especially girls, about sex. We pretend that children don't have any sort of sexuality, which is not true. And obviously there needs to be age appropriate conversation, but I think we need to have that conversation. And I think what that leads to, that lack of conversation leads to a sense that, especially when you're told don't do it, a sense that sexual desire is wrong, you know, and feeling good about your body is wrong. And also, I think it enables sexual abuse. So when children have been sexually abused, they feel somehow they are complicit and, you know, that they've done something wrong, which obviously leads to feelings of shame, you know, which people can grow up with, and it causes all sorts of issues along the line. And also, even when children have been spoken to about sex, they've been spoken to about sex in ways that assumes that there is only one sexuality, you know, usually heterosexuality, which also leads to issues, you know, for children growing up when they realize that, you know, their sexuality doesn't correspond to what they were made to assume was the norm.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's really helpful. That's super helpful. I mean, throughout this book, there are heart-wrenching stories of women experiencing, or girls and women experiencing sexual violence, and at times it was difficult to read, and sometimes you. So I want to move to the vignettes that you share, the prefaces. I'm not sure what you call them, interludes of a story, which I found to be very insightful in framing things. And so when you are traveling through all these various things, hearing all these stories of these various people throughout their lifetimes, because it's not just something that's happening to them in this moment, it is also so much about like decades of experiences that people remember in different ways. And so I'm curious to know how you went about creating these vignettes or interludes, or what do you call them, the intros to each story, and what do you think they add to the overall book?
You know what? It's a great question. And this is actually one of the ways in which the US edition of this book differs from the UK edition. Yes. Yeah. Because the UK edition has like what I thought of as almost a blurb, like a really, really short, like a paragraph, that just sort of spoke very much to people's identities in terms of their gender, sexuality, where they came from. And then when I started working with my American editor, Alessandra Vestagli, she had like lots of questions. She was like, I want to know what connected you to this person's story, and what were you thinking and what were you feeling? And I had my personal essay right at the book of the UK edition, and she thought it would be interesting to like intersperse my essay throughout. So I guess what I then tried to do in the US edition was kind of like guide people a little bit through the book, through the stories, also just sharing a lot more of myself than I'd done in the UK edition. And so it was interesting because it was a completely different process. So yeah, I feel like I have two very different books. So I'm glad you're also interested in getting both editions.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yes.
Because
yes.
to me, that would these excerpts from a larger essay, or the way that you reveal more about yourself, I felt I saw more of a connection to you, to the women in the book because of that. And my next question is actually about diaspora. And why is this book, I think I know, but I don't want to assume. Why is this book diasporic and not just African women living on the continent, or just from Ghana, or African women in the UK? Why is it diasporic? And if you could also talk about what diaspora means to you, or diaspora means to you, that'd be great.
Yeah. No, I think that's a super relevant question. So until a few years ago, I'm almost ashamed to admit that I had no idea how far-flung the diaspora was, right? I knew of the diaspora in places like the States and in the UK where I spent some time, but I had no idea that we had, people of African descent in places like Honduras and Costa Rica. And that we actually had actual communities who had held onto their African identity, and had kept many like rituals and practices. When I went to the north of Brazil, and actually I think we met in Brazil as well, right? Briefly. I was amazed by like the culture in Bahia. People on the street would speak to me in Portuguese because they assumed I was a Black Brazilian woman. And all of that really left an impact on me. It just sort of reminded me of the fact that as African people and as people of African descent, we've been separated because of slavery, because of colonization, because of migration. I identify as a Pan-Africanist, I identify as an African feminist. And for me, the reunification of African people is really, really important. So I wanted to, in a sense, bring African people wherever they are together through the book as well, and use the book as a device to connect our stories, because I actually felt like we have a lot of similarities, even when we've been raised in different parts of the world. And so for me, it was politically important to do so. And it was also politically important to call the book, The Sex Lives of African Women, as opposed to The Sex Lives of Black Women, for instance.
Say more about that. I'm a Black Studies scholar, and so we are always reading, writing, talking about what is Blackness, who is Black,
Yes.
Africanness, all those things.
Yes. No, for me, the identity of being African is also about our experiences that are rooted on the continent of Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And also, for me, there's also something about reclaiming. I feel like there's a way in which, and sometimes Blackness seems to be a little bit like, sometimes people are trying to get away from Africa, right? And being Black is a bit more acceptable than being African. So I guess I'm also claiming a pride in being African and saying, hey, let's be proud of our identity. Let's be proud of our roots. Let's celebrate the connections that we have and our relationship to this continent. Yeah.
Gotcha. That's it's just an ongoing conversation. It's
It really
is. How do people understand themselves?
Yes.
And then what are the categories that we are told we are?
Yes.
How are we placed into particular identities, whether or not we like it? I was also really, really intrigued about how much the women in the book moved around the world.
Yes.
They moved so much. And to me, movement, being in flight, being travel, and even movement of gender and sexuality. Those are major themes throughout the book. And so perhaps now is a good time for you to read a little bit from Solange's story. I think that really exemplifies that.
Yes, absolutely. And again, for anybody who is following along, I'm going to read from the beginning of Solange's story. But because you mentioned travel, I'm now oh, should I read from somewhere in the middle where it's to a bit more of their journey? Yes, I think I'll do that. Okay. So Solange, just to give people some background, because I'm going to read from the middle. Solange is a trans woman who originates from Rwanda. And this story travels briefly through Congo, where they spent some time, to Montreal in Canada, which is actually where they started their transition, and then goes back to Abidjan, where they traveled after they had begun their transition. And so I'm going to actually read from page 189. Not everybody is able to stay on the journey with us during transition. I spent 5 years in a relationship with a Haitian man. I did not plan this Haitian connection today. We bought a house and a car together. He even met my parents. I loved him and wanted to get married, but he was not ready to do that because he was not fully out. When I started to transition, that was too much for him. He felt that if his parents saw me, they would perceive him differently and know that he was not as heterosexual as he had been portraying himself to be. He had been telling them that he was living with a male friend, but now this man was becoming a woman. He was especially worried about what people back home in Haiti were going to say. That brought our relationship to an end. In my relationships with women, there's been a peacefulness that doesn't exist in my relationships with men. I was 17 years old when I first fell in love with a woman. At the time, my family and I had moved to Congo because of the war in Rwanda. She was the daughter of our landlord, and we lived together in the same compound. My brother had a crush on her, and I told him, "You can have any girl you want, but not this one." He was surprised. "You've never been interested in girls. Why? Do you want to marry her?" I didn't want to marry her, but I knew I loved her. We had a close friendship and would spend ages teasing each other. We kept in touch throughout the years, even when my family left Congo and moved to Zambia. Years later, she expressed an interest in also moving to Canada to study, and I was able to share tips with her on how to find a good university. I opened up to her when she moved to Canada. When I told her I like men, she said, "I already knew." I asked her how, and she said that other guys who liked her behaved differently. Being open with her allowed an intimacy to develop between us. My feelings for her were more than physical. I felt at peace whenever we were together. Sometimes we would kiss. Other times we would kiss and touch each other. Sometimes we would not kiss, but do something else. I loved holding her in my arms, feeling her hair on my shoulder, touching her skin. Each experience with her was different. Nothing felt forced. There were no expectations. When she came over because she wanted to be with me and not because she wanted to have sex with me. This was different from my relationships with men. With men, they have this attitude: I have to come. If I didn't come, we didn't have sex. When I started my transition, she was supportive. She's also a queer woman, and she told me that our intimacy and love making had always felt like being with another woman, even though at the time I was in a man's body. When I started transitioning, I also started to embrace the experience of exploring my changing body through sex. Every stage of the transition was an opportunity to get closer to different types of people. There are people who like feminine men. There are people who like cross dressers. There are people who like folks that have started hormone treatments and have breasts. At every stage of the transition, there will be people who love us as we are. The only challenge is that some people want us to stay at the same stage where they met us. They don't understand that we are evolving, and so you have to be strong and say, I haven't reached the end of my journey yet. Experiencing sex at every stage of my journey allowed me the opportunity to really get to know people. I was now in my body as a woman, and I decided to start traveling the world. I wanted to experience different cultures and meet different people. Doing sex work allowed me to travel and also allowed me to connect with people all over the world. Sex work allowed me to come back home to Africa and to experience love with my brothers and sisters. Sex work allowed me to get in touch with the real me. I still have some clients from my time as a sex worker who are now my friends and lovers. Most of them are people who describe themselves as heterosexual. Some of them are married, and I am their second or third lover. Some of them are single men. At the beginning, there was some questioning because of the presence of my male sex. Some were initially not comfortable, but in time, they learned to love me, love my body, and love my personality. They learned to enjoy sex with me, and I learned to understand them, to understand their way of life, and to not push them, because most of them had never been with a trans woman before. My experience of sex with women is also very different now that I am a trans woman. I realize now that women did not sufficiently recognize me as a woman when I was in a man's body. There was this charge of being privileged, of benefiting from the patriarchal system. Now I feel more accepted by women. My experience of sisterhood with other women is much easier. We meet as women who have common experiences around the male gaze, and that creates an intimacy where no one woman is superior to another. My lovers know that I have multiple partners, and they are comfortable because we are not in an exclusive relationship. They know that my experience of sexuality is in a state of freedom. I feel very rich when it comes to my sex life. I feel sexually fulfilled. I can experience different aspects of my sexuality with different people. In French, we describe that as épanouie. J'ai une vie sexuelle épanouie. And my French is clearly terrible, so I apologize to all the French speakers who may be listening.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, every woman's story is phenomenal. And Solange's story, to me, it moved me all around the world, and also through a journey into figuring out what Solange wanted sexually and like as a person, and just super compelling. But whereas Solange was able to find a state of freedom through an experience of sexuality, there are many other women in this book who have varying experiences with their sexuality or how they understand themselves. To me, this book, yes, is about stories and confessions for sure. But as an organizer, I understand that our work, particularly as not even just as Black people, but it's about telling a more complete story so that we can create or craft more complete solutions for the things to the things that happen to us all over the world, and to create the kind of world and societies that we want to live in. And so I'd love if you could talk a little bit about how these stories give us a more complete sense of what sexual violence looks like across the world. And in turn, what is it that our societies need to do? And even what do we need to do, particularly if you identify as a feminist, to address and eradicate even sexual violence?
I love what you said about, the need to tell a more complete story so that we can have more complete solutions. That totally resonates with me. If you can hear anybody in the background, that's my 2-year-old toddler.
Hey.
And for me, that was really my intention with this book, right? Because I felt like we were missing more holistic stories of the experiences of African women when it came to sex and sexuality, particularly in Western mainstream media. I feel like we are portrayed in very stereotypical ways, right? We are either the vixen or, specifically when it comes to African women, we are portrayed as vectors of disease, women living with HIV and AIDS, or women who have experienced female genital mutilation. And that may be a part of the story, but it's only a part of the story. It's not the complete story.
Okay.
And like in speaking to African women directly, you will get the more complete story. You'll get the more holistic story. You will hear the pain and the trauma, but you will also hear the agency and the joy and the moments of happiness. And I think it's important to look at that all together. Yeah. And so in terms of like sexual violence and what can we do around sexual violence, I feel like it's really about comprehensive sex education. For me, that really feels like a critical first step, right? For children to know their bodies, to know the correct names for their body parts, to be, given information about sex, to be really told the truth about sexuality being on a spectrum, to be given access to family planning and a range of options, to be taught about self-pleasure and to be told that's a legitimate option, to be taught about how to deal with desire and what the options are. I feel like it's the silence that causes the harm. And also, as adult women, for us to have access to a whole range of options of healing services. There's so many ways to heal, and what works for one person may not work for another. So for us to be able to access that, and for us to be able to negotiate sexual freedom on our own terms, because what works for one person will not necessarily work for another person.
That's right. I'm drawn to Miriam's story, and when I was reading when I read Miriam's story, it's like, did no one tell these men that this wasn't okay? Did no one tell these men that you shouldn't touch anyone without their consent, and a child cannot consent? And it seemed like it was just commonplace. It wasn't. It didn't seem in particular. If it was happening to her, it was happening to other children, and not just girls. I'm sure it was happening to children who weren't girls as well. And so the comprehensive sex education that you talk about, it goes like there's one. Oh, here it is in Miriam's story, where she says, in 10th grade, we were taught about the human body. Quote, this is your shoulder, this is your arm, this is your vagina, the end. And we know that our bodies are so much more than even just the parts.
Yes.
Like we do so much in our bodies. We feel in our bodies. We take action in our bodies. All those things. And so it's just, and I think about my mother. My sex education from my mother was pretty much the same. Just don't do it. Like that was the thing, and it's so insufficient. It's not enough for us. It's just not enough. So we heard Asantewa in the background. What kind of world do you want for her?
I want a very, very different world for her. I want a world for her where she knows she has a lot of options, where she recognizes that, her sexuality could be on the spectrum. I think very few people identify their sexuality as fixed. I'd like her to feel she has options to transition at any stage in life, right? Um, and I want it to be affirmed by society. So it's not that she's getting one form of education from me at home and then she goes out to the world and then she's seeing something completely different. I want her to be affirmed in all her choices, and to have that freedom to travel through identity, travel through the world. I feel like we talk about travel today as if it's a new phenomenon, but I really don't think it is. I think people have always moved. People have moved because they want a better world, because they want to find fresh land for their animals to pasture. I feel like movement is a part of life. Movement also allows us to have new opportunities. And so I want her to live in a borderless world, frankly, where she is not limited by where she can be because of the color of her skin or because of her gender. And I think travel also allows women to access more opportunities. There was a time I was speaking to my grand aunt who died when she was over 100. So this gives you a sense of what she had seen. And she was telling me, yes, about two of our women ancestors who, like back in something like the 18th century, had moved from present day Kumasi to where our village currently is, in a region called the Kuru region of Ghana. And in today's time, it takes 6 hours by car to do that journey. And they traveled on foot because they wanted to find husbands, right? Because they were of the Ashanti people and they were constantly going to war. And so the men were always dying. And so they moved for love, and I think that's also one of the themes that comes across in this book, a woman moving for love. And I feel like, yeah, we should be able to move for love, we should be able to move for life, for work, yeah.
That's right.
It's the kind of world I want Santua to grow up in.
Yeah, that sounds like a feminist, an African feminist freedom, an articulation of what freedom looks like and what it can look like, and even what our charge is and what we can do. So before we transition to any audience questions, I have maybe like two more questions that I have for you. So I don't know if this is the same in the UK version and all the versions of the first version. You call it what do you call the first version?
The UK edition.
Cool. But it's divided in three parts: self-discovery, freedom, and healing. How did you come to that sort of organization for the book?
Yeah. Once I'd interviewed about 20 women for the book, I did the sort of very geeky thing of putting everybody's like details in a spreadsheet. And I was just trying to sort of analyze the information that I was getting. So I was writing down the words that kept coming up for me, right? Like travel, movement, healing, discovery. And I just sort of realized that actually these were the big themes of the book. There was a theme of people trying to figure out who they were, trying to figure out who they were in terms of their identity, trying to figure out, what their sexuality was, trying to get to know themselves, trying to unlearn things they had been told as children. And there were some people who had experienced a lot of traumatic experiences and were trying to heal from those experiences or needed to heal from that experience. And then there were people who were, for me, almost like role models. I felt like they were living their best sex lives. They had figured out this whole freedom thing. People like, Solange, where you're just like, whoa, yeah. And so for me, these were the broad themes. So it's the same in both editions of the book. What's the same is the sections. And, even if somebody was placed in freedom, I think you can sometimes see really strong themes of self-discovery or some themes of healing. So yeah, some people are in slightly different places in the UK edition, which is also interesting. So I am really curious to hear in future from people who've read both editions to see if they agree with some of the changes I made or if they think I should just keep it how it was in the first one. So that's a challenge for people who are going to read both.
Lovely. Okay, now I have to hurry up and get the UK version. Yeah, I need to know. So I am a writer and also a filmmaker. And so maybe this is partially a plug for myself, but I'm wondering, where do you want this to go? Because I'm reading this, and maybe you can't speak to it. I get it if you can't stop talk about it. But I'm reading this and I need to see it. You know, I know it's a bookstore, it's a book talk, but I do believe that we need to because it started as a blog,
Yes.
right? And you've done some other digital sorts of projects with the overall project. Yeah, with the overall project. And are you done with this project, or do you see it growing in more forms of expression?
Yes. No, I love, Charlene, that you're a writer and a filmmaker. I wish I also had some filmmaking skills. I don't. I don't have filmmaking skills. But I would definitely I feel like my principal job was to write this book. And I am really happy for other people to like transform it into other mediums, you know. Quite a few people have said we want to see this as an episodic TV show. Yeah, I was reading an article yesterday that No Violet Bulawayo had. It wasn't an article; it's a feature of No Violet Bulawayo in one of the women's magazines, and they'd asked her which book she'd most want to see as a Netflix show, and she mentioned my book, and I was so excited because I love No Violet, and I had no idea she'd read that book.
Yeah.
You know, that was super exciting for me. Yes.
Oh my gosh, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. So connected to that, you are a writer, as you said. Could you tell us about, you don't need to like say, I'm working on this particular project, but what is exciting you these days? What are you drawn to as a writer? And how would you like to continue to tell stories that matter to you?
No, that's a great question. I love writing about sex, to be honest. I don't think I'm ever going to get bored or tired of writing about sex, even though I've been writing about sex since 2009. So I actually want to do more research around sex. And this time I want to try and find ways of working more collaboratively with groups of women. And, you know, I'm interested in running workshops and those workshops informing my next book. So, yes, yes.
Beautiful. Oh, I'm excited to see whatever you decide to offer us. I know it will be brilliant and that it will be necessary. So I want to open it up to any questions from other folks who joined us today. And I'm not sure how do folks type them in the box? If not, I will continue.
And I'm also happy to do another short reading if that also allows people some space and time.
Ooh, that's a treat. Yes, please.
All right, let's see. So initially, I've read a piece from Self-Discovery. I've read a piece from Freedom. I am going to read a piece from Healing, actually, in a section of Shanita's story. I like Shanita's story because, yeah, she was actually practicing celibacy at the time that I interviewed her. And I think, you know, in thinking about sex, it's also important to remember the choices of people who, for various reasons, may choose to abstain from sex. I think that's also a legitimate part of discovering and rediscovering your sexuality. And so, yeah, I'm just going to read from the beginning of Shanita's story.
Lovely.
I've been celibate for almost 1,000 days now. In that period, I have focused on loving myself, raising my son, and opening a salon of my own in Boston. If I hadn't chosen to stay away from men, I wouldn't have been able to achieve all that in the last 3 years. Previously, I was so distracted by men, relationships, and desires of the flesh. Now I can see the rewards of patience and sacrifice. I've learned so much about myself. I never realized how much self control I had for a start. I now know that I'm able to stick to my goals. I also love the new me that emerged. I used to find the old me annoying. She was a shopaholic, constantly spending money and partying. Being celibate was not just about sex, it was also about breaking free of all forms of distractions. and delving deep into myself so I could understand why I used these as a crutch. I wasn't ever extreme when it came to sex. I wasn't a sexaholic, for instance. I was a serial monogamist, and I often found myself staying in relationships way after I should have moved on because of my desire for the other person. A few years ago, I was in a relationship with a man. We had fun. We had a lot in common. We also had a friendship. When that relationship ended, I had to ask myself some tough questions. Why do I constantly end up in this kind of situation? What is it about me that I need to change so that I don't end up with someone who doesn't want me as much as I want them? I decided to spend some time retreating into myself. I read a lot. I prayed a lot. I sat through many dark nights until I had a realization. I am the light. I am what I need in this world. Everything starts and ends with God, but through me. And so the only things that I can experience are those things that I allow to happen. I realized that I needed to take back control of my life. This meant that I had to focus on myself. I had to take some time away from people. This resulted in me pushing a lot of people away. Some of those were good folks, but that was just where I was in life at the time. I got really quiet, and out of that stillness emerged my 100 days of self love practice. All I wanted to do in that period was nourish my body and soul. During those 100 days, I ate healthily, I barely drank alcohol, and I took myself on dates. At the end of the period, I decided to take a solo trip to St. Martin and Anguilla in the Caribbean. I had never traveled alone before. The mere idea had always been scary, and so I decided that I needed to conquer that fear. That also meant dealing with mom guilt as I left my son home with friends and family. During that entire 100-day period, I also stayed away from men. The only men that were ever around me were purely platonic friends. That was how my celibacy journey began, as part of my practice of self love. At the end of my trip, I decided that I wasn't going to have sex with anybody who wasn't worthy of me and the celibacy vow that I had made to God. And I'll stop there.
Mm, this is one of my favorite stories too. So I'm glad that you read it. Shanita, and what you said is so important for us to understand that sexuality can mean many things. Like Shanita
Mhm.
didn't lose a sense of her sexuality because she was celibate. When she talks about masturbation,
Yes.
and even like how people define celibacy. And if nothing else, this book teaches me and perhaps other people, it doesn't matter how other people define anything. It is
True.
about what you need to do for yourself. And
Yeah.
so if she understood her celibacy as including masturbation, then it was that,
Yep.
it was about her. And then I mean, I felt like it was a cliffhanger, and I want to know what happened between her and she was dating. Like, um, did her celibacy journey, like how did it, how did it progress? I'm super curious
Yes.
about that.
I know. I've said to myself, kind of jokingly, that in about 10 years' time, I need to do an updated edition with where are they now?
Absolutely. We want to know, we need to know how everything went down. So
Yes.
I really enjoyed Shanita's story. Um, let's go back to you. Let's go back to you. What did you learn about yourself? And not even just like this is like a decades long project. So you can talk about now, or you can talk about even a moment after you heard a particular story, you had a particular conversation. Describe to us what you've learned about yourself throughout this process.
Mm. I'm sure you guys can all hear my daughter in the background, right?
That's
She's so excited. She's at that 2-year-old stage where they take up so much space, and I love to see it. Yes.
What's her sign?
Say that again.
Did you say her sign?
No, I said she's at that 2-year-old stage where they love to take up space, and
That's
I
right.
love to see it. Yes.
That's
Yes.
right.
What did I learn about myself through this process? It was, I have never really thought about healing. I've never thought about the need for me personally to heal from my own experience of child sexual abuse. It's never been something that's been at the forefront of my mind. It's always something that I felt, it was horrible, it happened, but I'm one of those really pragmatic people. And I'm also one of those people who really compartmentalizes.
Yeah.
But when I spoke to so many women and they shared how they were working on their own healing, that for me was inspirational. I thought, oh, wow, okay, it's important to heal. And I think for me, my fear has always been, almost like if you open up that box, you don't know what you're going to reveal and what you're going to like traumatize yourself with. But I realized that healing doesn't have to be traumatic. Healing doesn't have to be healing doesn't have to be traumatic. And there isn't just one way to heal. Healing doesn't mean you have to go and see a professional therapist, for example, right? It could be something that you do on your own. It could be a journey of self-love, like Shanita's own, except I don't think I could do the 1,000 days of celibacy or 100 days even. It could be like what Gabriella did, where she went on a retreat, on a spiritual retreat. It could be like Bingy. Bingy for her, sex was healing, right? So I liked that. I think for me, the lesson was it's important to take some space and time to reflect and figure out what works for you. And I'm usually not very good at taking space and time for myself. So I think that's one of the things I learned through this book, that, it's important to give yourself space and time. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So you mentioned that, maybe in 10 years, you could do a Where Are They Now? When you look back on the process of collecting these stories, because I imagine there may be some people who are listening to this who are like, I want to do a project like this. What are some lessons that you learned about stories, and even the more technical part of recording them and putting them in a collection?
Sorry, my dog barked at one moment. What did I learn about? What was the first thing you said?
For sure. The first one was about there may be people listening who want to do their own collection of stories of some sort. What are some lessons that you learned along the way about how to tend to gathering these stories, how to approach gathering these stories? And then the second part, the more technical sense of how do you put something like this together?
No, that's a great question. When I first started this, I really wanted to interview people face to face. That was really important to me. And I think interviewing people face to face allowed me to just get more and more comfortable with asking people really intimate questions. It also allowed me to build rapport, right? I mean, there were some people the first time we met, all we did was sit and drink a bottle of wine and just sort of chit chat and get to know one another. By the end of my process, also because it was the pandemic, I was interviewing people on Zoom. But I think taking that time to really interview people face to face and build rapport with people face to face was valuable when it came to interviewing people on Zoom. I think it made a huge amount of difference, And in terms of my own process as well, I also did a number of call outs as well. I did call outs on my blog. I did call outs on Twitter. Technically, I would also record the conversations. Obviously, I'd ask people their permission to do that. I think it was really important. I documented myself telling people about the book, about the process, and getting their explicit permission. I think that's really important. I also give people choices, right? Did they want to use their real name? Did they want to be anonymous? And I know that sometimes people may say things they may not intend to say. So I would often say to people, you don't have to decide at the start of this conversation whether you're going to use your own name or whether you want to use a pseudonym. You can decide after the conversation, or you can even decide a couple of weeks after the conversation. And for me, that was really important because I wanted people to feel comfortable with the decision that they had made, But the actual process of, interviewing people, transcribing, deciding what the story would be, that for me was really interesting. I did my transcription myself, which was a bit of a pain. I used a robot, and then I had to go through everything because robots are not accurate, especially when it comes to people's voices. But then that made it enjoyable, actually. And sometimes in doing the transcription, I would hear things I hadn't heard during the interview process. That was amazing. So it almost felt, the story was being written in my head whilst I was transcribing the interview, and then it made it much easier to just, put it down on the computer afterwards.
Love it. Thank you so much. Before we close out, is there anything else that you want people to know about this book, about yourself and your work that we didn't discuss today?
Thank you, Lynn, for sharing up the book. No, I mean, I don't know what else to say, just to say thank you, Charlene, for this amazing conversation. It's been so good to chat to you. I'm looking forward to reconnecting, physically soon.
That's right. Thank you so much. You're brilliant, and what a gift. What a gift.
Yes, thank you both so much. Thank you to the audience who attended. I especially love that last part about your process. The bottles of wine had me in that special place, but also the kind of compassion you were showing for what these women's concerns might be, and how you met them where they were. Yeah, I can't wait to see your next project. So thank you both again so much. Be well.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.